Welcome to this lecture on Java classes. I'm hoping that most of this material you've seen before, but there are some things, some ideas that are going to be new, I believe. First thing that might be new might be these terms like client and server. So when you set up a class A and an instance of that class, an object A uses another object B, then object A is usually referred to as the client and object B is the server. So that's all it means. It's not supposed to mean client and server as in a networking situation where you have a client computer and a server computer. No, that's totally different. This is sort of related, but this is pretty different. So this is in Java classes. One class will be a client and another class will be a server. So we can say that a client sends queries and commands to a server. So a client queries or commands a server to do things or return data. And we represent it using this kind of a diagram. Here's a client, a client object sends a query to a server, and the server class responds with some message. And essentially, what is this message? It's just a return value. That's all it is. So when we say query, but all it really means is call method. So this client player class calls the method called current square in the server, which is the piece class or piece object, and then the current square method in the piece object returns a value d1 to the client. So pretty simple. It's not that supposed to be that complicated. So you can have commands as well. So if, let's say you have your client class, which is player, and a player object sends a move to method to the piece object. This is maybe the before situation. It has data members like color, rank, and square. Color and rank are not going to be changed by this move to method. The move method, let's say, is going to change this square on the chessboard. So this is all assuming that a player represents a player in a game. This piece object represents a chess piece, which has a color, white or black. Rank, which is the kind of thing it is, pawn, queen, bishop, and so on. And also a position, and which is here referred to as square. So let's say it's initially a D1, you send a command, move to C2, and if that's possible, if for a queen to move from D1 to C2, then after the command is executed, the square will have changed. The color and rank will not have changed, just the square. So before executing the command, this piece is at D1, and then after executing the command, it's at C2. So command methods, if you remember, change a data member, in this case the square, from D1 to C2. Okay, so that's all pretty simple. You've seen queries, you've seen commands, I hope. If not, you might want to review queries and commands. And in this lecture, the only terms we're introducing is client and server. So this is the client, player is the client, piece is the server. Okay. So we'll use this counter class. It's an ongoing example from the book. And so this class counter has queries and commands. Queries are things like current count. All it does is return the current value of the data member count. It should be a non-negative integer. If it's negative, then we know something has gone wrong. Commands would be things like increment and reset. So increment just should increment the value of the data member count by 1, and reset should set the value of count to 0. So this is like a starting list of responsibilities for this counter class. Now you might want to change it. You might want to add decrement or something else that you might want count to be able to do. So let's say these are the kinds of things you want. You start out with class and you want to make it a public class, that is, this counter class should be in its own .java file. So if you remember that a single .java file can only have one public class. So if you see public class by itself, then you know that for sure it's in a counter, in this case counter.java file. And all the definitions of features, that is data members and methods, all those things go into here. I'm hoping all of this looks familiar. If you remember /*, those are Java doc comments, and typically you want all your .java files to be in named packages rather than the default package. You can put things in a default package, but it's not recommended. Always put things in a package with a name. So if you want to set up a query method, it's always good to have Java doc comments. So /*, put in some comments that describe this method. You might want to do that right away before you even type in code. In this case, the method current count is going to be the name of the method. It's a query, so it's going to return something. So the type of value returned by the query should be specified. Can be anything: ints, floats, doubles, strings, other objects, and so on. And most of the time, almost all the time, query methods will be used by external classes, that is clients. And remember, this is the server class. The counter class is the server class. And so all of the queries probably going to be public. Now, it's every once in a while you will set up queries that are private, but and for this set of examples, we're going to use all query methods are going to be public. That is, they're going to be used by some client class that's outside this class. Okay, so pretty straightforward. I'm hoping that if you remember methods, this is all going to make sense. Remember to put Java doc comments. You want to make a public query method, so it has a return value, name of the method, and then open close parentheses. In this case, you don't need to pass any parameters to this query method, and it's going to return something. So eventually you should have a return something, some kind of integer. Take a look at one of the command methods, which is increment or increment count. Once again, put in Java doc comments. Return value, you don't need anything. You're not going to return anything. Typically that's true. It's not always true of command methods, but typically you have the name of the method, and quite often command methods are void methods. That is, they're just supposed to do something, change a data member in the server class in this case, and then doesn't have to return anything. Okay, so in this case, the type of value returned by the command is void. That is, it's not going to return anything. You also have to set up a reset method, but let's move on and take a look at the class constructor. So this is the constructor for the counter class, our server class. Remember that counter classes, remember that for a counter class, the constructor will have the same name as the name of the class. Return value, of course, remember there's no return value for constructors. You want to put in Java doc comments just like you did with the other methods. So /*, describe the constructor. This is a default constructor, that is, it doesn't have any parameters, just has a name, and then make it public. It's very rare that constructors are going to be anything other than public, because they're meant to be used by outside classes. But there are exceptions. So for now, just remember, all constructors, make them public. Maybe much later on you'll see instances where that's not the case. And you probably know this name of a class constructor is the same as the name of the class. You can have multiple constructors. You can overload constructors. Yeah, that's definitely allowed in Java. If you look at the class diagram of a counter now, we set up a query method that's a public that returns an int, an increment. We didn't really specify the details of reset, but you can probably guess what it is. It's a public method that it's a command method, so it doesn't return anything. It's a void method. And you have this class diagram for the counter class. I'm hoping all of those things make sense. This UML diagrams you've seen before. If not, you want to review your UML diagrams as soon as you can. Okay, so in this case, when you call the current counter, you have some client somewhere that calls the server. In this case, the server is the counter class. Let's say you set up an object called myCounter with a count value, which is currently, let's say, 4. What the current count method should do is take this count method and return it. And so you will return 4 to this client class. Okay, so let's take a break here and take a look at some of these ideas in code. So I'll bring up Eclipse. So let's say you have a server class, which is the class that's going to be used by some other class. Usually you'll have some data members. You might have something like this. You have a static data member, that's a final in this case, and I made it public. Remember, that's okay. If something is final, it's okay to make it public, but everything else I've made private, that's what you want to do with all data members. Your constructor has the same name as the name of the class, and it's responsible for initializing data values. In this case, it just happened to be initializing this status data member to 0 and the data member to 5. You can also pass in parameters, and in this case, we are overloading the constructor to take a single int, which is going to be used to initialize the status variable. And then finally, we have two methods. GetStatus, as you can guess, is a query. It returns an int, and all it's doing is returning the value of status. Start method, take a look at it. You can see that it's void. It's doing something. It's changing data members. So this is, of course, a command method. So the start in this case just sits in a loop and updates status depending on whatever value data has. Okay, so there's our there's our server class called server, and a client class, all it does in this case is instantiate that server class. So it creates an instance of the server class right here in the start method, and then calls the start command method of the server class, calls a query, the getStatus method, and then prints out that value. So very simple. This is the kind of thing that you can expect a client to do, that is initialize, create an instance of this server class, call start, getStatus, print it out. Typical command method, typical query method, and then these are the kinds of operations you can expect. In this case, it turns out that client itself is set up in a main class, which has a public static void main, creates a client, and then calls the start method for the client. And if you remember, all that does is on the client you call the server. So in this case, it just so happens that this client object or client class is actually a server for main. So it's not like client is always a client of something and never anything else. In this case, this client class is used by main, and so this client is a server for main, server is a server for client. So server in this case is just purely a server. It's only being used by one other class. Client uses server, so it's a client, and client is also used by main, so it's a server to main. So client is a server to main, a client to server. Hope that's not too confusing. So it's just that these roles can be more complicated than just being one class always being a client and one class always being a server. No, that's not always the case. It's often the case, but it's not always true. Okay, so let's take a break, and we'll come back to these topics in the next video.